chills.
Number 6. Body parts at the Rancho Los Amigos Hospital. Just outside of downtown Los Angeles lies the Rancho Los Amigos Hospital in Downey, California. The hospital itself is still in use to this day, but other parts of the facility have been sealed off and forgotten long ago. Since the hospital was originally established in 1888, some of these walled-off sections are extremely old and extremely haunted. Starting in the 1950s, the hospital began to focus on treating polio and shut down its other facilities, including an old mental asylum. The asylum was called the LA County Poor Farm, and it was where the elderly, the homeless, the disabled, and the insane all lived together. There was also an army base nearby and even a small zoo, though all of this was abandoned by the 1980s. One day, two ghost hunters named Marsha and Kirsten decided to sneak into the abandoned area and take a look for themselves. Inside, they found a boarded-up ranch home along with tons of abandoned buildings. It felt like they were walking around in a miniature city, except something wasn't quite right. Even though all of the buildings were empty, Kirsten describes feeling as if each place was still occupied. When they approached the army base, they both felt as if hundreds of people were watching them at once, and they both felt this at the same time without saying anything to each other. The atmosphere only seemed to get more and more threatening as they wandered further inside. When they reached the mental asylum, Kirsten noticed there was still lots of expensive lab equipment, books, magazines, and other important looking items laying around. The buildings themselves were old and full of toxic asbestos. They clearly needed to be vacated, but she still found it odd how the workers had chosen to abandon all of their belongings. It was almost as if something had scared them off in a hurry. Overall, the experience left Marsha and Kirsten sure that they weren't alone during their adventure. Something else was with them the entire time, they just knew it. To use their words, exploring the haunted mental asylum felt as though you are in another world, one that does not belong to you and whose inhabitants don't necessarily welcome you. With this in mind, they are sure that there has to be a hidden history to the hospital, a darker reason that would explain why the workers suddenly decided to close off a large portion of the hospital from the rest of the world for good. These two ghost hunters were not the only ones to have a creepy experience on the old grounds. In 2006, United States Marines were using the abandoned buildings as part of a basic training drill. As they were doing a sweep from room to room, they came across an extremely old freezer that looked evil enough to catch their eye. The team opened it up and were shocked by what was inside. The freezer was full of body parts that were at least 30 years old, if not older. Several legs, feet, and shriveled up brains all filled the room with a putrid stench. As it turned out, the Marines had stumbled into an old abandoned morgue area. These body parts were supposedly from amputations, but no one can say where they came from for sure. This begs one simple question: are there more human remains on the property? And if so, could this be why everyone who sneaks inside feels like they are being stalked at every turn? Number 5. The Death Tunnel of Waverly Hills. The early 1900s was an especially dangerous time to live in Louisville, Kentucky. This was when a strange disease known as the White Death was sweeping through the nation. We now call it tuberculosis, but at the time, all Louisville citizens knew that it made people cough up blood, and if you got it, there was no cure. Their town was hit the hardest out of anywhere in the nation. Those who caught the sickness were sent to Waverly Hills Sanatorium to be experimented on until they died painfully. When Waverly Hills first opened in 1924, it was considered one of the best hospitals to treat tuberculosis. In reality, they were doing almost everything wrong. For example, patients received plenty of fresh air and sunshine to combat the bacterial infection, which did seem to help them to a certain degree. However, the same logic meant they were left by open windows all year long. It wasn't uncommon to see a person dying of tuberculosis while covered in piles of snow that had drifted in from outside, or else dying from the blistering southern heat in the summer. Sometimes they were left on a porch, but other times the patients were left on a roof to survive the elements. Other tuberculosis sufferers were forced to undergo much stranger treatments that seemed to border on pure torture. Their lungs were exposed to ultraviolet rays in an effort to stop the bacteria from spreading, and sometimes large chunks of their lungs were removed as well, if not the entire lung itself. It also wasn't uncommon for doctors to crush a nerve that controls your breathing so that one lung would be effectively paralyzed. This resulted in permanent shallow breathing and all sorts of other deformities. Waverly Hill patients would also sometimes have as many as 8 of their ribs removed. Since tuberculosis causes the lungs to swell with infection, surgeons performed this procedure so that the infected lung would have more room to expand, but it didn't really help. In fact, it almost always resulted in a painful collapsed lung, which is why less than 5% of the patients survived this procedure. Perhaps the worst treatment of all involves surgically implanting balloons directly into the lungs and then filling them with air. Clean air was thought to help fight the infection and strengthen the lungs, but it really did nothing other than increase the patient's suffering as they slowly died in misery. Even though these operations all had a low survival rate, doctors just didn't know what else to do. So many patients died at Waverly Hills that moving the bodies out became a real problem. Staff didn't want anyone to know just how many people were dying under their care, so they created a tunnel specifically for getting rid of the dead. This death tunnel started at the hospital morgue and opened up at the bottom of a hill by the railroad tracks. The bodies were then lowered into the trains and sent away. It wasn't uncommon for entire families to pass through the death tunnel at one point or another. Fortunately, as tuberculosis became less of a threat, the hospital became less needed. It was eventually transformed into the Woodhaven Geriatric Sanatorium, which is basically like a retirement home from hell. Here, electroshock therapy was administered on a regular basis, and rumors of the elderly being terribly mistreated was also standard practice. A lack of funding meant that the treatment was just awful. In 1982, the facility was condemned and shut down by the state for good. The property has since become the subject of many ghost stories as told by anyone brave enough or foolish enough to go exploring. Most stories especially seem to center around a mysterious 5th floor, which is supposedly where the mentally insane tuberculosis patients were kept. This way, they were properly isolated from the general population, but could still get fresh air and sunshine. Ghost hunters who come up to the 5th floor often start to feel paranoid and anxious, and this might be because of the previous staff as much as the inpatients. As the story goes, a head nurse once committed suicide on the 5th floor in room 502. She was 29 years old and pregnant when she tied a knot around her neck and hung herself from a light fixture. In 1932, another nurse is said to have jumped from the roof. She too worked in room 502. No records exist to confirm this story, but many locals say there was a cover-up to keep it under wraps. To this day, if you go into room 502, you might see shadows in the windows or even hear a voice sharply ordering you to get out immediately. Ghost sightings aren't just limited to the 5th floor. A man dressed in a white chef's coat is often seen walking around in the kitchen, where visitors can smell fully cooked meals. Sometimes you can even hear his footsteps along with the smell of freshly baked bread in the cafeteria area. There's also a little boy with an old 1930s leather ball to play with, and a woman with bleeding wrists who comes screaming at you for help. Other than that, slamming doors, shifting shapes, and lights in the windows despite a lack of power are all commonplace. Of course, there is no shortage of video evidence to support all of these paranormal claims. Number 4. Mental torture. The Fairfield Hills State Hospital in Newtown, Connecticut opened in 1931 to help with overcrowding at other state hospitals. 16 buildings spanned across 770 acres, housing up to 4,000 patients at a time. To the outside world, Fairfield Hills looked like a charming place to stay. However, it was really the place of insane misery and unspeakable cruelty towards the disabled. These methods of mistreatment included lobotomies and other forms of highly invasive brain surgeries. There was hydrotherapy, which is where a patient was forced to take a warm bath that would last for hours to even days. These baths were administered in a quiet room with low light levels and no other forms of stimulation. Sometimes the subject was simply sprayed with water instead. For most hydrotherapy baths, the temperature was between 92 and 97 degrees Fahrenheit. For certain mental disorders, cold water anywhere from 48 to 70 degrees was used instead. The patients were always restrained, and they were never let out until their time was up, not even to use the bathroom. When the hospital finally closed its doors in 1995, Stories of strange happenings began to flood the small city. Apparently, the abandoned area became a hangout for members of a satanic cult, and even more famously, the haunting grounds for a young female ghost who was always dressed all in white. This ghost was even the center of a paranormal television show on MTV called Fear. According to many who have seen her, she will typically stare at you through a certain window. There is always a glowing light behind her. Like the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky, the Fairfield Hills State Hospital has a series of underground tunnels that link the 16 buildings together. This way, staff, patients, and even corpses could be moved from building to building as needed without causing a disturbance. These tunnels were also the source of many paranormal encounters. It was not uncommon to hear screams coming from the tunnels as well as from the buildings themselves. Perhaps this is why the tunnels have since been completely filled in. If you are thinking of exploring the Fairfield Hills State Hospital for yourself, you might want to think again. Local authorities have been cracking down on trespassers and the penalties are fairly steep. If caught, you can expect to pay a $100 fine and spend the night in jail. Still, some brave explorers can't resist breaking into the property and having a look. As evidenced by the following footage, they almost always experience something not of this world. Number 3. Body Melt. Established in 1868, the Athens Asylum in Cleveland, Ohio was originally meant to house soldiers who were traumatized from battle during the Civil War. Here, they could sort through their own thoughts and nurse themselves back to health by tending the area's beautiful gardens and greenhouses, or by working on the dairy farm. Ponds, fountains, and orchids provided breathtaking scenery that would help them relax and find a new purpose in life. The Athens Asylum started out as a very nice and well-meaning facility, but it would not last for long. The staff soon realized that they could make a lot of money off their patients and became more and more greedy, putting profits before proper treatments. They overcrowded the hospital with far too many patients and put them all to work, whether they were capable of handling it or not. They also became more lenient with who they were accepting into their ranks. Soon the asylum became known as a place where you could drop off your teenage son or daughter if they became too rebellious. Not that the other supposedly legitimate reasons for being committed were all that great either. In the late 1800s, it wasn't uncommon for people to be sent to the Athens Asylum for masturbating too much, an act which many thought could cause a person to go insane. In fact, 82 patients were sent to the hospital specifically because of that reason alone. By the 1950s, the Athens Asylum had more than 2,000 people, some actually insane and some not so much. Regardless, the hospital was 3 times over its legal capacity. This large population overwhelmed the staff and made them begin to act even more cruelly than ever before. Patients were forced to soak in ice water baths as they were beaten or restrained for days on end. They were even shocked with electricity straight into their brain, or worst of all, given lobotomies. A lobotomy was when a surgeon takes an ice pick and jabs it beneath your eye, straight into your brain. This medical procedure, if you could call it that, was designed to disable the brain in an effort to keep a patient's emotions under control. It was never a good idea to begin with, but at the Athens Asylum, they were effectively using it to create mindless work slaves. Eventually, the asylum was shut down in 1993. By then, countless lives had been permanently changed by the staff's abuse. Many say that their unhappy spirits haunt the grounds to this day. Nearby Ohio University students would hear screams coming from the hospital. Those who went inside would see shadowy figures standing in the hallway and otherwise feel extreme dread. Then there is the famous ghost of Margaret Schilling. Margaret Schilling was a 54-year-old patient who went missing on the 1st of December 1979. The exact circumstances have most likely been covered up by the staff, but Margaret was probably trying to get away from some sort of abuse when she wandered into an abandoned area of the ward that was for tuberculosis victims. No one had any idea what got her next. Some say it was the spirits, some say it was starvation. Whatever it was, when employees found her 42 days later, she was completely naked and face down. All of her clothes were neatly folded next to her corpse. An autopsy showed that she died of heart failure. Her body had started to melt into the concrete, and the stain remains there to this day, along with her spirit. Why the outline of her body is permanently in the concrete is something no one can properly explain. Some say that it was a chemical reaction from the way the sun was hitting her, but others say it was an angry sign from beyond the grave. Her death will not be forgotten. They feel she is saying something something with her stain. If you can scrub the stain, it will reappear moments later as if nothing had happened. Try as they might, no cleaning chemicals have ever been able to solve this. There is also an anonymous cemetery that has become the subject of much paranormal speculation as well. This is where patients with no family were buried. Instead of a headstone, they were given a white rock and a number. Thousands of bodies have been buried throughout the property, including many Civil War veterans. Aside from nightly ghost visits, there is also a patch of land near a creek with multiple hidden graves. This is where you can sometimes hear screams and see eerie glowing lights. At another part of the cemetery, the graves all form a circle. This is where witches would reportedly conjure spirits and cast mystical spells. Number 2. The High Street Ghost House. Built in 1892, the Sai Ying Pun Mental Hospital was originally built to house European nurses until World War II broke out. According to legend, the place was taken over by Japanese troops and used as an execution hall for quite some time. Countless prisoners of war were allegedly murdered here. Eventually, the Sai Ying Pun estate was converted into a mental hospital. It was abandoned in 1961 and badly damaged by 2 fires. Since then, there have been some extremely strange sightings. One is of a ghost who wears traditional robes on the 2nd floor. You wouldn't expect anything was wrong until he suddenly runs at you and explodes into flames. There are also headless figures running down the hallway at all hours of the night. These are presumably the executed prisoners of war. Finally, a woman often loudly cries into the night and footsteps boom throughout the property at random. Before we get to number 1, if you've ever been curious as to what I look like in real life, then follow me on Instagram at DylanIsChillinYT. I also have a Twitter at YTChills where I post video updates. I'd really appreciate it if you followed me, and feel free to send me a DM if you have any questions or suggestions. Number 1, the Manson Retreat. The Trans-Allegheny Asylum was built on the backs of prisoners in 1858. This Gothic building is so old. It first housed inpatients exactly 1 year before the end of the Civil War. It sits on 666 acres of land. With the way patients were treated, it's no wonder as to why this place is so haunted nowadays. For example, it was not uncommon for the staff to lock patients in literal cages and let them rot while covered in their own filth. They were often chained down and forgotten, left to scream and wither away, sometimes until death. Within a few decades, staff were already hearing screams in areas that were unoccupied and experiencing other strange ghostly sightings. Sometimes they would hear insane bouts of laughter or else painful groans coming from floors that were otherwise completely empty. By the 1950s, the hospital was housing up to 2,600 patients, which was more than 10 times past the maximum capacity. By this time, patients were treated as little more than prisoners. They had little light, almost no furniture, and certain sections even lacked heat during the frigid months. Even as late as the 1980s, the criminally insane were still being helplessly locked in cages. Even the infamous serial killer Charles Manson briefly stayed here. Thousands of patients were believed to have perished at the asylum over the years. Many of these cases were from neglect, while others were from suicide or failed psychiatric treatments. Their bodies are believed to have been buried in the mass graves throughout the hospital grounds. People often claim to hear voices hold full conversations with the walls themselves. Even the staff haunts the property to this day. Everyone from janitors to nurses are known to stalk the hallways before disappearing shortly afterwards. Perhaps this is because the staff themselves were disturbed by the institution, sometimes as deeply as the people under the care. One psychiatrist was reportedly haunted by the ghost of a man who committed suicide while under her watch. She claims the ghost followed her everywhere she went, even after she moved multiple times. Another time, a nurse was found dead and rotting at the bottom of a stairwell. Their spirits all seem to reside in the asylum, refusing to ever leave.